Hey guys, my name is Javier Perez. I'm currently a senior material artist at PlayStation Visual Arts Service Group out here in San Diego, California. I've been in the gaming industry for about 9 years now, and in this lesson, I'm going to be going over how to create different tiling patterns inside of Substance Designer. I'm not necessarily going to show you guys how to create a full-on material, but just go over some of the tips and tricks I use within the tile sampler nodes to get some of those challenging, intricate patterns that you guys might have some challenges creating. So let's get started. So first things first, I'm just going to start a brand new substance and just choose one of these templates. I'm just going to do a PBR metallic roughness just for simplicity. I'm just going to go ahead and save this to the desktop in case of any crashes or anything like that. So let's just do tiling patterns. Cool. All right, so the first thing I'd kind of want to go over is the tile sampler, or let's do the tile generator first off. So the tile generator is a small node inside of Substance Designer that typically everyone uses to create their tiling patterns. It has a few different inputs and it has a bunch of different parameters that we can play with. So I kind of just want to go over those with you guys a little bit. So first off, let's actually connect this into our normal and our height map. That way we can kind of see the different things that it's doing. So by default, substance height is actually turned off. So we have to go into the materials, default definitions, go into our graph, and then tessellation. We're going to turn up the tessellation factor and then move the scale up. And now you can see that the tessellation is in fact working here. Now, the one thing you'll notice is that we're not getting too much AO information, and that's because we also have to plug this guy into our ambient occlusion. But to do that, we actually have to create an ambient occlusion node first. So we're just going to plug this guy in here and then plug this guy in here. All right, cool. So we're ready to go pretty much. So by default, the tile generator starts you guys off with some basic tiling squares, which is pretty useful sometimes if you wanted to create some nice bricks here. We have a bunch of different options that we can play with. So we can do squares if we want. So those are a little bit more tighter. So you'll notice that as soon as we change it from brick to square, this turns completely blank. And that's because the scale of these guys is actually a little too high. So if we go down to 0.75, you'll notice that we start getting those back. Now, the reason there's a difference between the square and the brick, that's because the brick actually has a subtle bevel. So if we go back into our brick default, you'll see these squares have a subtle bevel and it's giving us kind of a softer fall off on these bricks. So I'm just going to go back into our square and kind of talk about them a little bit more. So as you saw there, we have the ability to scale these guys up and down as much as we need to. We can kind of push them together or push them out as much as we want. We can scale them randomly. So we have different scale here, and some are bigger than others. We can offset the position. So usually in brick patterns out in the real world, the patterns of bricks aren't necessarily on top of each other. In some cases they are, but mostly you see them kind of offsetted a little bit with each different layer as they're putting the cement down. So let's actually go ahead and do that super quickly. So if we want to take these guys and turn them more into like a brick shape, what I would do is let's actually take off the scale random. That way they're all uniform. And on this guy, we're going to start taking down, I believe it's the X amount. That way, yeah. So if we actually take the X amount down, it's going to be scaling them proportionally from left to right, and that's because Substance wants to keep the tiling pattern consistent. So that's why every time you lower the number of bricks, you'll notice that they keep stretching outwards, and that's because if we press spacebar in the 2D view, Substance Designer is constantly trying to keep the pattern tiling. So that's why it's not breaking the tiling, and we have these nice continuous patterns going. So now that we've actually just scaled these guys down, just into bigger shapes, now we can go back into the offset and we could freely move these guys. So now we have just a typical kind of pattern that you see in most buildings. So let's actually add some luminance random in here. And what luminance random does is it's giving us different grayscale values within our height map that is telling the shader where or how deep or how far out the bricks are actually being extruded from the surface. So with the white, with the lighter kind of more white areas, the bricks are being extruded kind of outwards, and with the darker areas, they're going inwards. So what if we wanted to do something a little bit more interesting with these bricks, or make kind of different patterns? So let's go ahead and try some kind of cool tricks that we can do here. So for this next pattern, I just want to go back into the tile generator and make sure certain numbers are okay, because it might give us some weird effects if certain values aren't set to certain numbers. So the one thing I want to make sure is that the offset is set to 0.5, because once we layer on another brick, I want to make sure that it aligns correctly. The other thing is that I'm looking for is powers of 2 on the X and Y. So for this example, I'm just going to do a 4 and, oh, that was way too much, a 4 and an 8. So let's actually duplicate this guy. And what I'm doing with this tile generator specifically is we're going to make this into a mask that we'll be able to use it to plug into a blend between this tile generator and another one that we create. So for this guy, I'm just going to go down into our luminance random and take that off. And the other thing I'd like to do is I'm going to go back into the scale, and I'm actually going to want to get rid of these gaps. So it might look a little strange, but I'll show you guys what happens. So once we have the one, it's essentially saying that these are pretty much next to each other. That's why we can't see anything. Now, if we go into the color options inside of the tile generator, we do have a few cool buttons that can create different masks within the tile generator. So we have checkered mask, we have a horizontal mask, and we have a vertical mask. And the vertical mask is what we're going to use for this little example. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a blend node. I'm just going to plug this guy on top, and I'm going to use a transform node. And I'm just going to plug this guy in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and just put it as a background. Now let's actually plug in our mask and see what happens. So there you go. Now we have a kind of different pattern, so it's not just a straight vertical pattern. Now the reason that I'm just going to talk about little reasonings on why we did certain things on the tile generator. So you'll notice that I set this back to the original one. If we had left those small little gaps, so let's go back to like the 0.95 that we had. You can kind of see that the underlying pattern is getting shown a little bit. So we wanted to avoid that as much as possible. And also if we did something like we offsetted this guy that wasn't a 0.5, you can kind of see the results that it'll give us. So let's just do like, I don't know, 0.52, just so you can kind of see what's going on. Again, we're getting just some weird intersections that we're not necessarily looking for. So that's one cool pattern that we can do within just using the tile generator on its own. So for this next one, let's take the same principle that we did here where we created a tile generator, and let's try to use that to our advantage and create a different tile generator, or sorry, a different mask that we can use to create a different pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just bring in another tile generator. And for this guy, I'm actually going to use, I talked about some of the few masks that we could use under the color options. Well, this one I'm going to use a checker mask. So what I want to do is I'm going to make this one kind of similar in size, so a 4x4, kind of an even pattern. But with this guy, again, if we left the bevels on, we're going to have some weird artifacts. So I'm just going to change that back to square. And I'm going to turn on the checker mask. So this is going to do one every other, kind of like a checker pattern would. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into this. Actually, let's actually just grab this guy. So I'm just going to edit the one we currently have. So what we can do here is let's actually bring this guy up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the luminance on, but with the offset, I'm just going to bring that back so there is absolutely no offset. So with this guy, now the way it is right now, we can actually plug this guy in and do the same kind of scenario that we did here. So let's do a blend. Let's plug this guy in. Let's do a transform. Let's just plug this guy in here. And then plug this guy into the mask. You can kind of see what it'll give us. Oh, I forgot to rotate this guy. So let's rotate this guy and see what it gives us. So there you go. Now we have another cool pattern that we can plug in. So it's essentially using the same principle. We're just using a transform node and a mask to kind of give us some different results. And the cool thing about this guy is that we can actually go into the original tile generator and we can start messing with the Y amount. So let's do like a 10 and see what happens. We start getting some kind of interesting, almost not even patterns. So if we want to do like 11, we can do 12. You guys can just play around with the different patterns. So now we have something that's a little bit more even. But if we didn't want to, if we want to do a 10, we could get something that's not as even, a little bit more interesting. Now, within the actual tile generator, you're not limited to what is included in the presets. I talked a little bit earlier how there is a pattern input, and the pattern input is pretty powerful as it's a way that you can plug in any shape that you make. So I'm actually going to delete this one. So I'm just going to bring in a brand new one. And I'm just going to do another tile generator. And before I do anything within the tile generator, I'm actually just going to create a basic shape. So we can do something like, I don't know, let's just do a square and let's just do 0.75 on this guy. Cool. And what we can do with this guy is we can do a transform node. I'm just going to rotate it. And I'm going to do a blend on this guy. And then I'm just going to do an add. So I like this pattern that it's given me here, but I don't like these edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this down to 0.5. Hopefully that gets rid of it. Cool. And what we can do here is now that we have this guy, we can actually use a transform and let's get it as close to the edges as possible. So let's maybe like right there. Cool. And we can do is add a edge detect, which is just going to give me just the basic shape or basic edge shape around here. I'm going to take down the randomness because I don't want those kind of weird artifacting lines there. And then we can start bringing it into a tile generator. So once we have it inside the tile generator, what we can do from here is instead of choosing one of these guys, we can actually go to image input. So now that we've actually plugged in this image input, you can kind of see the pattern that it's creating. So if we take this down to, I don't know, maybe 4x4. Cool. You can kind of see that we're getting a really intricate pattern just by creating something as simple as blending two different shapes together. This might not be the best for if you guys were creating normal maps. So let's actually take this down even more. So let's do a 2x2. Now, one way I would kind of give these edges a nice little bevel is I would just bring in the bevel node. And I'm going to show you guys the difference between what's going on here. So first off, let's actually plug this guy in. So I'm going to take this guy and just plug it in. And if we go into the normal node, you can kind of see that we're getting this kind of like aliasing on these guys because they're so sharp and the normal map is trying to figure out what to do. But if we plug this into a bevel node and we just kind of gave it just a little bit more information, so maybe something just like, maybe even that would be good enough. So let's just plug this guy in here. And let's go back into the normal node. Already we're getting a more kind of defined shape, and that could be pushed even further if we kind of bumped this up even more. So let's do like a 0.2. Sorry, let's do negative 0.01. Yeah, there we go. Maybe a 4. Yeah, that's nice. Now, one thing I am noticing is that they're not necessarily touching right as much as I'd like them to. So what we can do is The great thing about Substance Designer is that it's non-destructive. So even though you have this connection going, we can go back, and I believe it's this transform node that if we just scale it up just a little bit more. So let's actually go back in here. Let's scale it up even more so like can kind of see the values. There we go. Cool. So it's just needed a little bit more scaling, and now we have a nice tiling pattern. Cool. So far I've shown you guys how to create different patterns with using a mask. We've created patterns using some transformation nodes with the shapes and just kind of moving those into place. But what if we want to do something a little bit more advanced? And that's where the tile sampler node comes in. The reason I showed you guys the tile random at first is it takes a lot less time to compute things. So you see, as soon as I like let's just do this for example. I'm just going to bring in a tile generator. So you'll notice that the compute times on both of these are pretty different. So on this guy, we have 0.88 milliseconds. And even though I got this nice NVIDIA RTX, the tile sampler is still at a pretty high milliseconds. I mean, it's milliseconds, but it's still computing quite a bit of information. So I noticed that a lot of people tend to use tile samplers for everything, but we want to make sure that we're keeping within. We want to make sure that our graphs are running nice and smoothly. And a lot of the times, if you're not using any of these inputs, you should always go with a tile generator to create your different patterns. So the tile sampler in itself is pretty much the same as a tile generator in the way that it has the same parameters that we can play with. But you'll notice on this guy, we have a bunch of different inputs as opposed to the tile generator, which only had one. So the cool thing about these different inputs is that they actually do different things depending on what you plug in. So we have a vector, we have rotation, displacement, background, etc. So let's go ahead and create an interesting pattern using the tile sampler. So what the funny thing we could do with this guy is we can actually plug in a tile generator within a tile sampler. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to first make a pattern, kind of something simplistic. So let's just do like, I don't know, a 10 by 10 works, or maybe something smaller, 8 by 8. Sure, that works. And with this guy, I'm just, again, going to use it as a mask. But with the interesting thing with the tile sampler is you don't actually have to bring in blend nodes and do kind of the same procedure that we're doing with these guys. So let's just go ahead and do that. What I want to do is I just want to have vertical black and white lines here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that both of these have the same amount on the X value. So I have an 8 here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that my X value is good here. So I'm just going to do X there. And I'm just going to set this to 1. I'm going to set this to a square. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the horizontal, no, vertical. Yeah, cool. Now from here, I'm going to go back into this guy. And what I want to do with the shape of the pattern in here is I want to make these guys look a little bit more like bricks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the sizing options. And I'm just going to bring these down a little bit, something like here. And I'm going to go into the rotation and do something like 0.15. So cool. And from here, I kind of want to get these guys as close to each other as possible. So maybe something like this. Let's actually scale these guys. Scale these guys up. Getting a weird kind of, let's actually move the rotation here. I think I was looking for a 0.12. Cool. And I want to get these as close as possible if I can. So I'm just going to get them like right, maybe 0.20. Again, these numbers aren't set in stone, and there might be instances where, you know, we're constantly fiddling around to make the pattern work. Not every time you kind of plug in some numbers, it's going to be perfect. So it's just almost like a testing ground to see where we can get the closest. So with these guys, I still want to get this gap kind of taken away and almost similar in this fashion. So what we can do here is let's actually bump this to 2. Something a lot of new users don't always get right off the bat when learning Substance is that sometimes these parameters, you can actually plug in certain numbers and it's not arbitrary to how far the slider goes. So feel free to play around with plugging in some numbers for yourself. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So just keep that in mind. So again, I'm playing with these guys. Let's do like 0.20, maybe 0.19. Yeah, that works pretty well. Now that we have this cool pattern going, like almost a horizontal brick pattern, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this guy into our rotation map input. Now, what I want to do with this guy, because I plugged into the rotation map input, I'm going to look for our rotation kind of parameters. So we do have a slider here called rotation map multiplier. And if we start bringing this guy up, it's essentially going to take the mass that we plug into the input into effect. So if you'll notice, here, let me just tone this down. So wherever there is a white area, it's starting to rotate. Whereas wherever there's a black area in the mask, it's staying completely the same. So it's essentially saying white, we do what this parameter is intended to, and black, we do not. So what I'm going to do with this guy is I basically want to get them pretty similar. So like maybe like 0.25. Cool. So maybe you like this pattern on its own. So let's actually just plug this guy in. And you think, okay, that's an interesting pattern. So there might be instances where things like that happen, happy accidents. But this isn't necessarily where I want to go with this pattern. I want these tiles to be more lined up. So I want to move the newly rotated ones upward a little bit. So to do that, if we go into the tile sampler parameters, under, I believe it is position, we have this displacement map input. And if we move that up and down, nothing is happening. And that's because we don't currently have anything plugged into the displacement map input. So the cool thing about the tile sampler is that we can keep creating different masks to plug into each one of these different inputs and get some pretty interesting, crazy results. Or we can just keep using the same mask and plugging it in. So for this instance, I'm just going to use the same mask and plug it in. And if we go back into our position, we now have the displacement map intensity. So if we just move this guy left or right, the angle in which these guys are moving is dependent on this displacement angle. So if we set this to something like 0.25, let's see, 0.25, that's going to set this guy in the vertical kind of area. And now that we start moving this guy, you can kind of see our newest rotated bricks are moving up and down. Now, one thing I noticed as soon as I start messing with this is that it looks like somewhere within our values, something is messed up. So we're getting a little bit of some odd intersection. So let's go and try to troubleshoot that really quick. So what I would like to do first is I'm just going to turn both of these guys off. So that way we can go back and look at our tiling patterns. So far it looks pretty good. So it looks like it's something to do with this guy. So if we go back into our rotation map multiplier, maybe we can mess with something. So maybe I just went a little bit too far off here. So there we go. I just changed it to a 0.25. It was at a 0.26. And just take note, something as small as almost a 0.1% is going to really mess up your graph and might kind of give you a headache. So always keep in mind those values and make sure to just look at the different, if you're trying to troubleshoot something, make sure to look at your values and make sure something isn't off. So let's do a 0.25. And now that I have it at 0.25, I notice I do want to displace it just a little bit higher. So maybe do 32. Might be too much. We can actually go into 0.315, so maybe 32. There we go. So now we have a clean tiling herringbone pattern that we're able to texture. The other interesting thing is that you might be wondering, that we could have easily done that if we just used a transform node on this guy. Well, if we bring in a transform node to this guy and then just do a rotation like this, if we take the space bar and see the tiling, you'll notice that the tiling is completely broken. That's because this transform 2D doesn't know how to compute like this kind of 90-degree angle bricks. So you'll notice that each brick at the tiling region, it's going half and the other one aren't. So the transform 2D is trying to keep it tiling, but at the same time, it's always going to break your tiling for this guy. So there's sometimes instances where you actually have to manually do things like that. So again, in the tile sampler, we also have the ability to, just like we did in the tile generator, where we can mess with the luminance, but in this case, it's actually called color random. So if we just bring this up a little bit, now we have these different valleys within our bricks and our ranges. So before I go, I want to show you one other node that'll help you guys create some cool, interesting shapes that you can then plug into a tile generator. And that one is the splatter circular. And this one's cool because, we can create some radial patterns. So we can do some kind of cool stuff like this. We have a bunch of different presets. So for example, let's take one of these. I don't know. Let's actually plug this guy in over here. So if we plugged in, let's just take this random tile generator here. This can kind of create some cool patterns, or, maybe you created a brick with a cool floral pattern on it, or maybe you just find something interesting to utilize this guy with. So it's always a fun way to plug like different patterns in here. And again, the non-destructiveness of it, like what if you wanted some bolts on each one of these? I don't know. It can be from like maybe not only can this be bricks, but you can also make it metal panels if you'd like. But let's actually go ahead and create one more pattern with the splatter circular node. So what I want to do is I'm just going to bring in a shape here, and I'm just going to do a regular square, but I'm going to actually rotate it 90 degrees so to get a diamond shape. Now, you might be wondering, this is always going to be tiling, but what if you want to break the tiling on this guy? Well, we can actually go into the settings for this transform 2D node, and we could go to the tiling mode, set this to absolute, and we can actually tell Substance we can have it no tiling, horizontal tiling, vertical, or H and V, which is always set. So if we do no tiling, now we have just a basic diamond. But now we can actually go in and shape it to exactly what we need it. So I'm just going to do something like here. And I'm going to do another transform 2D node. And what I want to do with this guy is I just want to squash it in half. And then I want to offset it to the very top. So 0.5, I believe. 0.5, cool. So now that I have this shape, what I want to do is I'm going to plug this guy into the splatter circular. So let's actually just plug this guy in. And let's set the image input to that new diamond that we have here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the pattern amount to 3. From here, we're just going to go into our parameters and try to get our desired look here. So I want to move these guys in a little bit closer, but I also want to scale up the size of just the overall shape. So maybe something like that. Cool. Now I am noticing that we're getting some kind of weird shape here, and that might be due to the fact of the transforms in the beginning. So let's try to fix that a little bit. So let's go back into this guy, and it's going to have this one selected, but I'm going to be able to move into this guy. So, okay, it's doing something interesting. So maybe it's this guy. There we go. It was this guy. So I'm just going to try to get something that I'm happy with. Cool. And now that we have it in the splatter circular, what I can do is just scale these up even more so. And we'll go back and forth just to see the scale of these guys. So maybe something like this. Cool. A little bit too big, actually. So if there's a way to scale these guys up, yeah, that actually works. And I want to rotate the whole pattern. So yeah, 0.25. Cool. This might be off a little bit, but we will see. Maybe 90. Yeah, there we go. So now we have this cool pattern, and what we can do is just plug it into a tile generator like we were doing earlier. I accidentally chose a color node on accident, so let's do a tile generator, grayscale. And I'm just going to plug this guy in here, and I'm going to change the image input. And now we can do our usual, just our offsets that we have been doing. So let's do offsets, I think 0.5 or 0.5. There we go. And then we can just scale this guy up like we usually do. So something like there, and then we can mess with the intersections here, so something like that. Maybe -1. Cool. So let's plug this guy in and see what we get. Nice. We have this cool kind of sci-fi looking pattern, and we're able to again, just go in and start chipping away the edges, start texturing it however we like. So I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial and learned something useful. This was just a short little taste of what is achievable within the tile sampler node. Each one of these little kind of demos that I showed you can be interlinked and interchanged to create more and more complex shapes within the tile sampler node. Be on the lookout on NVIDIA's YouTube page for more tutorials, as I'll dive deeper in the material creation process within Substance Designer. See you on the next one.